So just a couple of quick reminders. This is a PDF I had posted from a web page that unfortunately the site is no longer hosting, but it's really good. And I wanted you guys to read it so badly that I made it an assignment that's worth 2 points. Looks like most of you guys have done this, which is great, right? I have to grade them. I did grade the virus articles, but somehow it says I have 2 left. I don't know how. Remember under grading, I won't click there now because I'll go to everybody because I'm not in my student view. I don't think I set up any, let's see, if I set up any examples. Can't remember. But some of you guys didn't get full credit because you didn't even write a sentence. And I just couldn't give you 5 points for a sentence. So you'll have like a little comment over here. Like, do you see, oh, see like for this one, it says great job. You see that little comment box? If you don't have a 5 out of 5, you have a comment written there. You might want to comment back, right? And like write a complete sentence or something like that, or back up your thought, so that when I'm nice and I go back and regrade, you'll get your 5 points. If you haven't done it, do it. So when I go back and regrade, you get your points. Other assignments I haven't graded yet, so sometimes it'll have like, see like this, the virus article has a T. But I've graded those, so that probably one of the 2s was me. I didn't grade my own student assignment, right? But when you click on it, you see your submission, right? And so for that, you know, that's a 0, right? I just was typing to show you guys how to submit an assignment. So there's that one I graded, but I haven't graded yet in Module 3 the reading one, right? If you've done the bonus, I haven't graded those yet. Remember, if you don't know how to snap a picture, bring it to class, right? Or show it to me after class on a Tuesday, not a Thursday. And I'll put your points in, and I'll add a little comment that says I saw it in class, right? So depending on how your notifications are set up, don't freak out when you see that. That's just my little way of making note that I don't have it in the system, but I physically saw it. And then we should be working on this discussion board. So those of you guys that like dates, right? So we added a date of the 27th on there at midnight. Really do at least the first part, right? So other people can comment, right? We only have 3 people so far that have posted something. And remember, you need to comment on 2 of your classmates. We want to spread the love. So last time we finished up innate, right? So we ran through these, and I posted the Wiley, which we don't do together, but you guys can do on your own to really test your knowledge. And so today we're going to start adaptive, and I'm going to be making some changes here, but I moved this around. This has some objectives that are crossed out, but I didn't delete them from my PowerPoint. I just added that I'm not going to test you on them because I think if I don't mention them, things don't flow right. And you'll notice it seems like there's a lot of lectures left for adaptive, and that's because I broke it up by each section of the chapter. So when we get to one of these sections, like we're going to talk about it very briefly and then move on. So I'm going to post some updated PowerPoints for that. But we're going to start out here with cell surface markers because they're really important. And I would have printed it for y'all, but I got distracted this morning, and I apologize. But this is a good thing to print maybe, because sometimes writing this stuff out really helps y'all, right? So this is a diagram in your book, and it goes over these different receptors, right? Or markers sometimes they're referred to as, because they'll help us identify a cell, that are found on these very important cells throughout your body. So a lot of them are involved in the immune system response. One of them is just referring to your just general cells. And if you notice, they're color-coded and even have little shapes to them. Hit the right button, Erica. There we go. I just need to hit it twice. Go to the next slide. So this one, you see this one? It's found on all of these cells here. And in fact, found pretty much on, by definition, all nucleated cells in your body. All cells that have a nucleus. So you must be looking at me strangely like, well, that's the definition of eukaryotic cell, right? Is having a nucleus. But we actually have one cell in our body that when it matures, it loses its nucleus. Anyone know what cell that is? Your red blood cells, right? So our red blood cells, I haven't done any research into it, but by definition, I would say the reason why we have that definition is they probably don't have this marker on them, which leaves them susceptible to infection. Because what this marker is called is MHC class 1. So, of course, it was the first one discovered. And this one really gets its name from, it's really important for our immune system to communicate with the cells. So when we try to do organ transplants and things like that, this was the guy that they're trying to match. One of them, anyways. And this is the major one. Because if you don't have a match, the immune system can't communicate with these cells, thinks there's something wrong with them, and will kill them. We talked about this last time, right? Natural killer cells naturally get their name from the fact that they'll kill cells not presenting MHC class 1. So I always consider like MHC class 1 as the cell's ID card, right? If you're not flashing your ID, right, you usually will get in trouble, right? And the same holds true for your body. So then we have another class, and this is a specialized class. So this is class 2, and it's specialized because it's only found on 3 different cells. It's found on B cells, and notice that we put together macrophages and dendritic cells because these guys have similar functionalities. So this MHC class 2, and these 3 cells are collectively usually referred to as antigen-presenting cells. I like to call them specialist antigen-presenting cells. Because in truth, MHC class 1 allows all your cells that have it to present antigen, to present something foreign that's gotten inside of them and they're presenting outward, right? These guys, on the other hand, are specialists at that. They specifically will take stuff inside their cells to present them to the immune system. So I call them the specialists. Okay, so we're getting ready to move into adaptive immune response, right? The major players of our adaptive immune response are called lymphocytes. They're broken up into 3 different cells. 2 of them are very specific for their interactions with antigens, foreign substances. One of them being the B cell. And you see this shape? I like that they drew it in this shape. This is commonly referred to as what? An antibody, right? But on the surface of the B cell, it's known as the B cell receptor. And each B cell makes its own unique B cell receptor. And that's what's really important about the adaptive immune response, is again, it adapts, it changes over time. Each B cell, when it's born, makes its own special B cell receptor, its own special antibody. And then as we continue on, we'll talk about 5 different types of antibodies they can make, 5 different classes and what they do. That's the last thing we'll do. And we'll talk about how those help the immune system recognize the bad guys. But then we have another set of lymphocytes known collectively as T cells or T lymphocytes. And they too have a receptor on them. So of course it's called the T cell receptor. It too recognizes antigen. But unlike antibodies, that antigen must be presented to that cell by an MHC class 1 or 2. So for T cells, we have 2 subtypes. Anyone know their names? We have 2 different types of T cells. The cytotoxic T cells, which as their names imply, cytotoxic, they'll kill cells, just like natural killer cells will kill cells, but they do it in a different way. And helper T cells. So how do we tell the difference between those 2 subsets? They have a receptor, right? Sometimes referred to as their co-receptor, or sometimes referred to as a marker, right? Because these help us mark or differentiate the 2 different types of T cells. So the marker is either CD4 if it's a helper T cell, or it's CD8 for a cytotoxic T cell. This has worked for me for 20 plus years, so maybe it'll help you. But I always remember 4-H, right? You know, that organization that teaches kids about animals and farming and things like that? Well, the good news is that CD4, right, is helpers T cells. So we know 4 and H go together, right? 4-H, just remember 4-H. CD4 cells are helper T cells. H for helper in this case. And a little play on words, right? When you say the number 8, if you're not really paying attention, right? It's like I told you I ate breakfast this morning. I did. You get it? The number 8 sounds like to eat. 8, right? Past tense of eat, right? And what do cytotoxic T cells do? Their name tells you. They're cytotoxic. They kill cells. Cyto refers to cell, toxic, kill, right? Yeah, they don't go by phagocytosis. So they kill similar to what we will see again for natural killer cells. They actually release enzymes that will kill the cell that they're attached to. So we'll see that. And then, remember, these are all receptors, right? So they're binding to something. Sometimes it's receptor to a receptor is presenting something that another receptor is binding to, right? So then we got to remember those pairs, and we'll start going over that. And it's almost like a secret handshake, right? Because again, why are these a problem? Because our body makes our own unique major histocompatibility complex so it can communicate with itself. So you can almost consider it a secret handshake, right? That's happening between these cells because of these receptors. So notice there's more receptors listed here, right? Whole bunch of CDs, right? For clusters of differentiation, which is how they differentiated the different cells, right? And of course, as they discovered them, they numbered them. The good news for us, not a graduate level immunology class, right? We're not going to go over those. But there's one left that I left off the label of. And that's this one and this one. So found on neutrophils and macrophages and dendritic cells. And we learned last time, remember, these cells can do phagocytosis, right? Neutrophils, macrophages, dendritic cells do a certain type of phagocytosis. Our main phagocytic cells, though, are your neutrophils and your macrophages. So remember, they have to have a way to recognize and attach to those cells. That's the first step of phagocytosis, right? One of the ways that they're going to recognize is a product of our adaptive immune system, which is the B cell. So the B cell, as we're going to look at later, has different parts to it. I keep saying B cell, don't I? The antibody produced by a B cell. So there's an antibody, right? Do you see how it's embedded in the membrane? And these two parts that stick out are going to bind to the foreign substance, what we call an antigen. This portion that's embedded into the membrane right now, B cells will actually secrete antibodies. So these will become free little Ys, right? And this portion that's embedded in the membrane right now is going to be accessible to the immune system. That portion, because when they were studying it crystallized, is called the FC portion of that antibody. It's the fraction that crystallized. So we just abbreviated FC. So that FC region of the antibody, that's what this receptor is binding to. So that's why it's called the FC receptor. And we'll see this in action, right? Well, that's an important receptor that our cells have specifically for antibodies, a product of our adaptive immune response. Okay, so are we going to see these again? Yes. Are we going to talk about them a lot? Absolutely. This is a good summary slide to the beginning of receptor hell for some of us. All right, so I'm just going to jump right into part 1, though. I'm not going to change my PowerPoint. And I forgot my water. That's okay. So this chapter is broken into different components. So we're going to talk about the major features, right, which we've kind of been talking about, right? Then we're going to focus on T cells today. And then we'll talk about antigen processing and those antigen presenting cells next time. And then our third lecture, we'll talk briefly about humoral versus adaptive immune, humoral versus cell-mediated. So we're in adaptive immunity, and then amongst adaptive immunity, we can talk about humoral, which a lot of scientists nowadays just call antibody response, right? But it was called humoral because it was this human component, right? Before we started studying other animals, the humans were producing. It was antibodies, right? So your body can produce antibodies, or it can have a cell response with like cytotoxic T cells attacking cells. So of course we look at this, but sometimes your body's going to do both, and sometimes it's going to make the wrong choice. It's going to go the wrong way, right? And you know, of course, you guys we're just scratching the surface, right? This is quite a complicated system. And we even skip over some of the specifics of it for time. But there's a vast amount of communication that happens in the immune system, right? So again, just like the markers, we're going to talk briefly about the communication. We know more, right? If you took a graduate level immunology class, you'd learn more. But we're still learning even more, right, about this complicated system, and why things go wrong, and how we can maybe change or affect, right, when it comes to disease. And then I guess we save my favorite for last, which is the B cells, which are the ones that produce antibodies. And they produce several different types of antibodies, what we call classes. So another name you'll see as you read, and you'll hear me say, is immunoglobulin, right? So again, it's a product of our immune system, so immunoglobulin, for the fact that it's a protein, and most proteins have a globular structure, their overall globular structure looks like a Y. So when we draw antibodies, y'all, it's like drawing people's stick figures. We draw them kind of in their stick figure form, right? We don't draw out how they actually are. But they're pretty amazing proteins. They are proteins. And they can help recognize the bad guys. So that's why they're definitely one of my favorite proteins. So remember, adaptive is this add-on that jawed vertebrates or higher vertebrates have, like ourselves. All animals, invertebrates, vertebrates, have what we've already talked about, which is the innate immune response. So they have this built-in pattern recognition receptors for recognizing general patterns like tectonic acid and peptidoglycan and lipopolysaccharide and what virus DNA looks like versus our DNA or our RNA, right? So it's generalized. What's awesome about the adaptive immune system is that now we're going to start talking about memory and remembering things. So what this system interacts with, and when it's initiated, it develops a set of cells literally known as memory cells that are going to remember the event when it happens again. So this gives us that really long-term exposure, and when we're re-exposed to some pathogens, you don't even know your immune system responded because it responds so fast and so aggressively that second time around, you don't even know it happened. So why is it possible? This is a little bit better picture, right? T cells we know have T cell receptors, but what do you notice about these 3 T cells and their receptors in this drawing? They're all different, but if you look at an individual T cell, its receptor is the same on its surface, right? But each T cell and each B cell, because notice their B cells, it's their antibody, which later they can secrete, so a Y all by itself. Each one is drawn uniquely, but the B cell itself is only making one specific antibody, and the T cell is making one specific T cell receptor. So when these cells are born in our bone marrow, right, they're literally playing their own game of the lottery. They are taking their DNA and rearranging it to make these receptors. And they literally cut out pieces and throw them away. Okay? So they're set. They're programmed, especially for the T cell receptor. B cells will tweak theirs a little later on, right? We call this maturation, affinity maturation. But for the most part, they're pretty set. And then the scary part, right? So as the diagram shows, right, T cells possess a T cell receptor. B cells possess, like I said, immunoglobulins is another name for an antibody. It's their B cell receptor on their surface. It is an antibody. When they actually secrete it, we call it immunoglobulin or an antibody. When it's on their surface, we call it the B cell receptor. All right, so some terminology. Some of it I've used already, right? I've used the word antigen several times. The word antigen comes from antibody generators, right? So anti, right, for antibody, gen for generators. So these are foreign substances when put in different animals, they produced antibodies against it. Now we use it as a little bit more specific term. We use it, if used correctly, as a specific term that binds to a T cell receptor, a B cell receptor, or an immunoglobulin, right? Abbreviated IG, or an antibody, right? Ligand is something that binds to a receptor, right? That's a general term. So an antigen, because it binds to a receptor, is a ligand. But when we say antigen, we're talking specifically about a ligand that binds to an immune receptor, either a T cell receptor, a B cell receptor, or the antibody once it's secreted from the B cell. So when I say immunogen, as the name implies, right? Immuno refers to immune system. Gen means the generation of an immune response. So are B cells the only type of response that we can do? No. We can have a cell-mediated response with T cells, specifically cytotoxic T cells. So Do you understand that those are general terms? When we say immunogen, we're saying the immune system is responding, right, to some stimulus, right? When we say antigen, we're saying something is binding to B cell receptors or T cell receptors or to antibodies. And then these are molecules themselves, right? The B cell receptor, the T cell receptor, and the antibodies, these are molecules. We're talking about small things, right? Proteins, to be exact. They can bind to very small things like other proteins, but even smaller than that. They're only binding to one little part of that foreign substance, of that antigen. We call that little piece, right, that the receptor is actually binding to the epitope, or sometimes you'll see the antigenic determinant. The good news is this book sticks to just epitopes. So let's look at a picture, because pictures sometimes are always the best for some of us. So here's an antigen. Imagine it's a virus, a bacteria, or even a foreign protein that gets in our body. Right? Anything that an immune receptor can bind to. So here they're showing a B cell receptor binding to it. Here they're showing an antibody all by itself binding to it. And here they're showing another antibody binding to it. But what do you notice about these two antibodies and this antibody that's the B cell receptor on the B cell surface? They're all binding to something different. Do you see that? They're all binding to a different part of this antigen. And then look, they have two more little pieces where nothing is sticking to it yet. So when you mount a response to a single antigen, like a single protein here, or a single bacteria, or a single virus, your body doesn't just make one antibody, or I wish they'd show a T cell here, not just one T cell receptor. They make multiple ones, right? Whatever will fit will bind. Still with me? Because it's an important point. Okay, so the epitope is where the receptor is physically binding, whether it's the antibody, immunoglobulin, B cell receptor, T cell receptor. Oh, I know why they don't show a T cell here today.
So the epitope is where the immunoglobulin binds to the antigen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's where on the antigen. Yeah, specifically. So you can imagine, like, say this is a bacteria. No, even better. Let's say this is a virus, and these are proteins sticking out of its envelope. But these are each a different protein, right? Yes. So we make an antibody against each one of the different proteins, if we can. That make... The reason why a T cell isn't shown here, I should realize it myself, is that T cells don't interact directly with an antigen. So they're showing you an antigen all by itself. T cells don't do that. T cells have to have antigen presented to them via MHC class 1 or 2. That's why they're only showing a B cell here. So B cells and T cells, if you just look at them under the light microscope, stained for the usual differential count, right? They're just going to look like this dark purple nucleus with usually a light blue cytoplasm. This one looks kind of purplish to me. I guess it depends on the stain. You don't know if this is a B cell or a T cell circulating in your blood. They're born in your bone marrow, right? So B for born, right? All your white blood cells originate from your bone marrow. And your red blood cells, right? But this is immunology, so all we care about is the B cells and the T cells, right? The white blood cells. So they're named, a lot of these things are named after, right? So lymphoid, right? So they're born there, and they're going to travel throughout the body. and they're going to form collections in certain areas. And this is where these areas get their names, right? Lymphoid tissues or lymphoid organs, if it's organized to the organism level. Your bone marrow is considered a primary lymphoid organ. That's where the cells come from, right? Where B cells come from, T cells, all white blood cells. T cells, on the other hand, get their name from the fact that they actually have to travel to the thymus before they completely mature. So T for thymus, right, which is right above your heart. B cells, on the other hand, are named after the bursa, which is an organ in the chicken. But the good news is bone marrow also starts with B, right? So remember, when they come out of the bone marrow, they're mature, right? They don't need to travel to a secondary site. So our primary lymphoid sites are the bone marrow, where the B cells originate from and they mature at. T cells are born in the bone marrow but must travel to the thymus to mature. And this is where their receptors get set, right? That CD4 versus CD8, their MHC ability to recognize MHC classes, right? There's a little bit extra work that needs to be done, and that's done in the thymus. Your thymus is quite large when you're little, right? And it atrophies around puberty. Atrophy means what? It shrinks in size. So scientists believed at one time it quit working. But does your exposure to antigens stop as we age? No. The number that we're exposed to that we remember decreases as we age, right? So we don't need as large of an organ as we did when we were first born, when you're getting assaulted, right? Literally, from the minute you're born, assaulted by all these pathogens you haven't seen yet, right? So it's working, over time. So it makes sense that it's large, right? And then it also makes sense that it doesn't quit on us, thank goodness, for the most part. So how do they travel throughout our body? One of the ways is through the lymphatic system. So in addition to your blood vessels, you have lymphatic vessels. These are specialized vessels. This is not like your circulatory system. It's not a circular system. It starts in your tissues, right? So you have vessels that literally start in your tissues, and they collect a fluid known as lymph, right? What this fluid is remember when we have inflammation, fluid leaks into the tissues because the white blood cells are leaving and the blood vessels become leaky. The veins become leaky. If we just suck that fluid back up into the bloodstream, can we potentially pick up pathogens? Oh yeah. And that wouldn't be good, because then they get a free ride on the superhighway we call our circulatory system. And I kid you not, a red blood cell can travel the length of your body at resting heart rate in less than a minute. It is the superhighway. It's fast, right? Under resting heart rate, can you imagine if your heart rate was elevated, right? How fast these things are moving. So to make sure that the bad guys don't get into our blood, but remember, if all that fluid leaks into our tissues, do we have enough fluid in our blood to pump the blood? No, it's like a low water pressure situation at home, right? You get in the shower and nothing falls on you. You're like, do we have a busted pipe or what's going on, right? So we don't want busted pipes, but we need to recycle that fluid, right? Water is very important in the body. It needs to be recycled. But we definitely don't want to let the bad guys in. So we want to do what to that fluid before we dump it back into circulation? We want to filter it. And the job of your lymph nodes, which are scattered, right, throughout the way of this lymphatic system, do just that. So guess what they're chocked full of? Who's going to eat the bad guys? Neutrophils, yeah, they could have neutrophils, but somebody who's really good at doing a lot of eating, that's a phagocytic cell. Macrophages. Your lymph nodes are loaded with macrophages and dendritic cells that we'll talk about, T cells and B cells, and that's where they kind of get their name, right? Notice everything is lymphocytes, right? Lymphoid tissue, right? It's all named after these B cells and T cells, these lymphoid cells that were found in this system. So we're going to filter and filter. So if you step on something at your foot, right, that lymph, and a lot of your lymph nodes are actually congregated in your abdominal region, because remember, your intestines is a tube that goes straight through your body. So as long as it goes in one end and out the other, no problem. It's when it leaves your intestines that we run into a problem. So that's a big area, believe it or not, where breaches can happen. So you have a lot of lymph nodes, right? Abdominal lymph nodes associated with that area. You have a lot in your groin region. That's to take care of your legs, everything coming from your legs. You have a lot in your axillary region, take care of everything coming from the arms. You have a lot in your neck region, right, in your cervical region, to take care of your head. Right? So all this stuff that drains from your head. But all of these vessels come together to form two ducts. So they're going to drain, like it's like all the stuff draining in New Orleans, which then eventually goes to the sewage plant, you would think, right? But guess where all the sewer drains actually dump? Into the river or the lake. Yeah. Depends on where you live. Right? Yeah, and we don't filter it. No. Sewage, yes. Storm drains, no. It would back up the system too much. Right? Our body, on the other hand, is going to filter it all, thank God. Right? Before it dumps it back into circulation. Where it does that is at your subclavian veins, right? Right under your clavicle. Your two lymphatic ducts dump, right? So all the lymphatic vessels come together throughout the body to two ducts. One on the left side and one on the right side. And they dump that fluid back in. So if you ever had swollen glands in your neck, those are lymph nodes, y'all. Swollen can be good. It means that your immune system's responding, right? If they're swollen excessively, probably you're dealing with an infection that your body could use some help. So you go to the doctor, right? Then the doctor palpates them. And they're tender and you want to slug them, right? Because it hurts. But that's a good thing. When you have lymph nodes that are hard, sometimes that's a sign of cancer, right? So notice the ones coming from the breasts, right? Us poor women and men. Men get breast cancer too, unfortunately, right? We're all mammals. We have mammary glands. Sometimes cells overgrow. The cells can travel to the lymph nodes and sometimes be trapped there. And that's why, like, when people talk about having surgery to remove breast cancer and they talk about lymph nodes, and you'll see some people, not as much anymore, they'll have lymphedema in their arm because they took a lot of lymph nodes. Nowadays, if there's a lot of lymph node involvement, if the cancer has spread, they'll stop taking lymph nodes and they'll irradiate them instead to kill the cancer cells so that you don't get the lymphedema that they used to have in the past, right? So we've learned a lot throughout the years, right, to try and make it better. But yeah, all throughout your body, right, we're gonna pick up this waste. Your spleen, which is the only organ you can live without, anyone know what that filters? It can filter lymph, but it also filters something very important, your blood. Although you can live without this organ, it's best to have it because it'll filter your blood. Your liver, which filters your blood too, right? And gets toxins and stuff out of your blood, can take over some of this job that your spleen does. Your spleen is a major one of pulling out your dead and worn out red blood cells too. Your liver has to take over most of that job if you lose your spleen. So yeah, they won't transplant it if you lose it, but you're more susceptible to blood-borne infections, right? And you have to be really careful with any type of infection. Because again, you don't want it in the superhighway, right? You don't want toxins. You don't want bacteria getting a free ride throughout the entire body. That can very easily lead to sepsis. So another area where we have a lot of stuff coming in, right, is our nose and our mouth. So you actually have 3 sets of tonsils. One that are in your throat. And y'all, when you look in someone's mouth, that little punction bag you see, what is that? That's part of your soft palate. It's called your uvula. If you have kids, watch Monster House. It's awesome. I never laughed so hard in my life. The house had a uvula. But then people learned what a uvula was. But that's basically so that like when you swallow, stuff doesn't go up your nose. Because your throat actually goes all the way up behind your nose, right? So all this stuff is connected. Remember I talked about this before? Your nose is actually connected to your throat, right? So things go down, hence the post-nasal drip, right? That god-awful thing that happens. But you know what? That's a good thing because we know the digestive system is going to digest bacteria, right? But because we inhale things right at the back of your nose, at the back of the throat, your nasal pharynx, right, which is the part of your throat associated with your nose, is actually one tonsil. Although it's referred to as the adenoids, it is one. And it's right between your eustachiary tubes. What are your eustachiary tubes? They're the ones that drain your inner ear. And this, again, is how your inner ear gets infected because stuff goes up your nose, goes up the tubes to your inner ear. And for little kids, those tubes are pretty horizontal. And then as you age, they tip, thank goodness, and they drain better. But when you're little, they don't drain so well. Hence all the ear infections kids get. There's multiple other reasons why we believe that happens too. But one of them is anatomy. We're screwed on anatomy, right? Until we get older. Your sinuses too, which are the cavities in your skull, right, are connected to your nose. So stuff goes from your nose up into those cavities. It can get infected, right? And you get fluid buildup, and someone says you sound stuffed up like I do right now, right? Mine's allergy, not cold. Allergic to my life. That's why, because your voice resonates in your head. And when there's fluid there, the resonance of your voice changes. Hence, you sound stuffed up, right? So you can literally, like, hear the difference if you know a person, right? The change that'll happen to their voice, which always happens to me around this time. And if you don't keep a watch on these things, right, that fluid buildup and that warmth just says, oh, hey, bacteria, have a home. And you end up with what? Sinus infections and inner ear infections and all this crappy stuff that isn't so fun, right? So you have that tonsil, which honestly I wish for me it was probably gone. And for my son, they removed 80% of it because it'll swell, right? And then it blocks the eustachiary tubes. So then they don't drain at all anyways, right? Because you got swelling back there. Can y'all imagine that? I'm sorry, I don't have a picture for it. Right? Then you have your palatine tonsils, which you usually hear people getting removed, right? These are actually literally in your throat. You have to look down someone's throat to see them, unless they're extremely inflamed. That little punching bag, remember? Soft palate, not tonsil, right? Tonsils are on either side. You have to kind of really look down the throat to see them. Apparently, you have a lingual tonsil, too, that's associated with your tongue. It's probably a really lazy tonsil because I've never heard of that one ever causing any problems. The problem is right there, they're chock full of what? Macrophages and T cells and B cells. And so they'll get inflamed and they'll enlarge because they're responding to infection. I don't know what you mean by stones. Yeah. Right. And again, you know, for some people, these tonsils get very aggravated very often, and especially if they're in your throat. Think about this. You can't swallow or breathe, right? Because still, again, nose connected to throat, breathing through throat, right? That whole need to breathe thing. So yeah, for some people, things can go wrong and they'll remove them. As an adult, apparently the surgery sucks big time, which is why I don't want to have it done. And I'm glad my son had it done when he was little. But he only had part of his adenoid removed. They didn't mess with his palatine tonsils. He doesn't have any problems with them. He's like me. It's all nasal allergy. Bullshit. Sucks. Right? So, very important note. These receptors, right? Notice this. Before exposure to pathogens. So you're making B cells and T cells in the bone marrow, and the T cells are heading off to the thymus and they're getting educated. This is before you even see a pathogen. So are we making these receptors specific for a pathogen? No, this is why I say we play the lottery every day and thank God we win inside of our bodies. Because they're basically picking their receptor, they're picking their lottery numbers, y'all, before they even see the pathogen. We make hundreds of them, billions of them, right? And they're all just hanging out waiting for the bad guy to show up and hoping we find a match. It's amazing it works, right? When you think about this. So why not make them so we could match? That would be awesome. We don't have a mechanism to do it. That's the main reason why not. Memory is because we've already seen it, though. Because one of these random guys already found it. So that's the good thing, right, about this system, is the memory component. But the very first time, right, the very first time a bad guy gets in, we're trying to find one of these ones that we've already pre-generated that matches, or that we're continuing to make because a bad guy got in and we're like, crap, we need to find a match. We got to find a match. Right? We got to defend against this. And this is the problem, y'all. The time it takes to find this match. Right? This is why we need innate. This is why we need phagocytic cells gobbling up as much as we can. Because it takes time to find these matches. Right? So once mature, though, these cells will migrate to all those areas, right? So your tonsils, your lymph nodes, your spleen, your lymph-associated tissue, the Pryor's patches you see in the small intestines, because again, that's a big breach area, right? So that's not organized to an organism level, but you can see patches and areas, right? When you look under the microscope, a cross-section of the small intestines, we call these Pryor's patches, where they're just loaded with T cells and B cells. And in our skin, right, we have tons of T cells and B cells and macrophages right there in case the bad guys get in. But that's not an organ, right? It's organized at the tissue level. So if it's the very first time, we call this the primary response. We used to call, if it's the second time we see it, the secondary response. But probably, I agree, a better name for it is memory response. And remember I said, what's the bad news? 7 to 14 days to see a substantial peak, right, where we've found our matches and we've got significant antibodies or cytotoxic T cells in the system. What we usually look at most often is antibodies because they're the easiest to measure, right? We can take a blood sample, right, and very easily detect the presence of these. But what's the good news? Once we do figure it out, right, in this process we're going to produce memory, right? So the second time or the third time or the fourth or who knows how many times we've seen this bad guy, most of the time it's a memory response. What's great about that? It's faster and more potent. So look at the lag, right? So this is immune activity even, right? So the immune system activity, whether it's antibodies or T cells, who knows, right? There's this period where it's real low. And then, we usually peak about 2 weeks out. If it's the second time or the third time, right, we've got memory cells. So notice how fast and how aggressive, how much more of a response we get when it's a memory response. So, perfect timing. Flu season, right? How many of y'all got your shot? All right. So, when you get your shot, which response are we initiating? Primary. So how long before you're protected once you get that vaccine if it works? On average, 7 to 14 days. Y'all, it isn't a magic shot. It doesn't work immediately. So I hate, right, people, and I hate the fact that we have the lack of education, right, that say, I got my flu shot and I still got the flu. Well, you might have had the flu before you even walked in to get the shot, or you got it sometime before that shot was effective. Or what's the third scenario? Actually, there's 4 scenarios, right? 1, you already had it. 2, it hadn't taken effect yet. It's a different strain, so what they immunized you against, you didn't get exposed to. What's another option? Are we all exactly the same? We're beautiful beings, aren't we? Are all our immune systems exactly the same? No. Did your immune system even respond to the vaccine? So unfortunately, sometimes that's the gamble we take, right? It just doesn't work for us. But again, you can't win the lottery unless you buy a ticket, right? You can't be protected unless you get the vaccine, right? You can't win the genetic lottery. You can't be protected unless you get it, right? Does that make sense? If you get the vaccine, right, and it works, and then you're exposed, right, look, memory response, you don't even know it happened. Because it's so fast, it's so aggressive, nothing happens for you. I don't know about you, but I like that. That sounds like a good plan to me. Never even know the attack happened. I gotta hit the right button. Did I not hit record, y'all? I remember the 1, 2, 3, right? What did I do wrong? I don't see anything. Oh, bugger. That's okay, because I can post one from some other time. Yeah, I don't see it. It says recorder. Click here to pause.